Today, I'm going to explore a crucially important topic. Hi all, I'm Isrado and you're watching my travel channel where I talk all things Colombia. Now before I moved to Colombia for the first time, I'd occasionally get the question from friends and family back in Australia of what I'd miss the most from my country. For most people, I can imagine there'd be some common answers, maybe you'd miss being able to speak your native language or the relationships you formed over a long period of time after growing up in the country, or even just generally the familiarity of your hometown and the ease of living that comes with that. For me though, I can honestly say that the biggest change I was concerned about was the cinema. I know this sounds so stupid, but let me explain. One of my biggest passions in life along with music is film. In fact, this was even my major at university. Although I've since had second thoughts about working in the film industry, I do still love talking about movies, reviewing movies, and perhaps above all going to see movies in cinemas. I realise I'm a bit of a relic on this, but I still really enjoy going to see every movie that interests me in theatres rather than waiting for it to come to streaming or whatever. It's becoming an increasingly expensive exercise, but the cinema experience is just something I find really cathartic. There's just not anything else that offers the same level of escapism, at least for me. So as I was saying, this was a pastime that I was worried I might have to give up entirely when coming to Colombia. Why? Well, because I assumed that all movies would be dubbed in Spanish, and although I speak enough Spanish to get by day to day, understanding an entire movie in the language is a whole different beast. I've said it before, but if you can comprehend an entire film in Spanish, good job, you're probably fluent. To me, there really isn't anything trickier with a second language than understanding it in a movie. Conversations? Fine. Writing? Fine. Watching a movie? Good luck. So it was with great sorrow that I assumed I'd have to give up one of my greatest joys in life, at least until I discovered I was wrong. See, as it turns out, pretty much every big new release not only has sessions that are dubbed in Spanish, but as luck would have it, also have sessions presented in their original language with Spanish subtitles. So that was a very pleasant surprise for me as I no longer had to give up my theatre-going habits, but the good news did not stop there. It turns out that despite offering more or less the same theatre experience as my home country, cinemas in Colombia are also comparatively really cheap. I think the expense is one of the main complaints many people of first world countries have about cinemas, and why a lot of people just don't bother going anymore, which I totally understand. The cost of a cinema ticket in Colombia though is just so crazy cheap by comparison. For example, if you just bought a ticket for a standard session in Australia, the regular price is around 25 Australian dollars. If you want just a medium-sized popcorn and drink on top of that, you'll be paying around $19 extra, bringing the total to about 44 Australian dollars. Movie tickets in Colombia, on the other hand, range from around $4 to $7 depending on the theatre you're seeing it at, and yes, I am including IMAX in that range. As for food and drink, you'll typically pay around $7 for a regular popcorn and drink. So if we compare the prices here, in Colombia for the ticket, popcorn and drink, that comes to a total of around $12-ish. In Australia, for the same thing, it's around $30. Now to be fair, this is largely due to the exchange rate along with lower wages in Colombia, so $12 to many in Colombia may feel like what $30 does to many in the US. I would say though there are still a lot of things in Colombia that don't have this stark price difference. Anyway, I've talked a lot about price, so moving on. Regarding the movies themselves, I noticed that the cinemas here don't have nearly as many films showing at any given moment. It's pretty much just the big new releases that get shown, but if it's anything other than a blockbuster or a select few Colombian films, then it likely won't make it to cinemas. Colombian cinemas also don't tend to do re-releases of existing films like you see in many other countries, nor do they show many non-US foreign films or movies from film festivals beyond the occasional Colombian film, as I said before. So all in all, if there's a big new release you want to see, it'll most likely make it to Colombian cinemas, but otherwise the catalogue is a lot smaller. To put it in perspective, at the time of recording this, there are 9 films now showing at the country's biggest cinema chain, Cine Colombia in Bogotá. Back in my home city of Sydney, on the other hand, there are currently 28 films being shown at our biggest cinema chain, Hoyts. Worth noting too that films tend to have a shorter theatre run in Colombia, so a lot of films showing in Sydney are films that did show in Colombia but have already ended their run. I should say too that Colombian cinema websites don't tend to show a schedule as far into the future, so if you don't see a big film you're waiting for listed in the coming soon section, don't worry, there's a good chance they just haven't updated it yet. Now, the one benefit I'd say Colombian cinemas do have over Australia's in terms of film availability is the fact that they do occasionally release films earlier than the rest of the world, especially Australia, as we're known to have later release dates than most other countries. Anyway, let's talk about Colombia's cinema chains for a bit. So Colombia has several different chains, but the two most common would have to be Cine Colombia and Cinemark, the latter of which also exists in several other countries such as the US, as I'm sure many of you know. There are also some smaller chains in Colombia, including Cinépolis, Procinal, but the majority of the time, Cine Colombia and Cinemark are the ones you'll likely be going to, particularly the former. You'll just about always find at least one of these two chains in every city of the country, and in larger cities like Bogota, you'll find a whole lot of them across different neighbourhoods. As I said before, the price for each of these cinemas can range, but interestingly, this seems to be based more on the neighbourhood that it's in, rather than how good the cinema itself is. For instance, I paid less to see Oppenheimer in IMAX than I did to see Barbie in a regular theatre, simply because the latter was in a more expensive neighbourhood than the IMAX. Once you arrive at one of these cinemas, it's fairly similar to what you're probably used to back at home. Most of the time you'll buy your tickets at one counter and then buy food and drinks separately at another. You can of course also pre-purchase all of this online at the cinema's website, although unlike cinemas in say my country, you'll often actually need to create an account first before it lets you do this. In terms of food and drink offerings, it's once again fairly similar to what you're probably used to, although the range of food probably isn't as large. Typically there's popcorn and hot dogs along with a few types of chocolate bars and sometimes some chips. In terms of the ice cream and lollies you might have back at home though, this is something I've yet to see in any cinemas here. Worth noting by the way, something very common to most cinema chains in Colombia is the option of choosing between salted popcorn or caramel popcorn, or a mix of both. Although most countries probably have this, I would say in Colombia it's a lot more universal across really every cinema I've been to. Beyond that, there is sometimes a Juan Valdez cafe stand within the cinema complex, so in those cases you'll be able to get a coffee and maybe some cafe food as well. Getting into the theatre experience itself, as I said before, I never noticed much of a difference between it here and back at home. Probably the main thing would be the actual theatres are usually right next to the concession stand, unlike Australia where they're usually through a corridor or in a separate area. I noticed too that the cinemas in Colombia seem to blend a bit more with the shopping centres they're usually in. Admittedly, I do kind of prefer my country's approach here. Like at the cinema in Sydney I go to, the multiplex feels very separate to the shopping centre, like they have carpet and some arcade games and you feel like you've stepped into an entirely new place. Also the thing of having several long corridors and then some flight of stairs leading to different theatres. I don't know, I'm probably the only person who cares about this kind of thing, but I think all of this really contributes to that feeling of escapism you get when you go to the movies, as opposed to Colombian cinemas where it's like, I'm in a shopping centre, and here's the cinema concession stand, and there's a theatre door, just straight up. To be fair, there are some multiplexes that break this pattern, like this one in Medellin I went to, which was pretty huge and imposing, but this seems to be an exception. Anyway, in terms of the stuff that people other than me care about, as with any country, the screen can range in size depending on the theatre, but it's generally large enough. Seats are fairly run-of-the-mill usually, nothing to write home about, but still comfy enough, and then the sound is generally fine too. I do remember going to a session last year where there were some issues with the audio, like for some reason there was this low pass filter on it and so everything was kind of muffled, but that's only happened to me once and they fixed it early into the movie, so it wasn't a massive deal. In terms of picture quality, this has generally been fine too, although there is one theatre in Manizales' Mall Plaza I remember attending where the quality was absolutely terrible. The resolution and the sharpness was fine, it was just that the dynamic range was abysmal, and so any black colours in the movie were like a mid-grey, and any whites just weren't bright at all, making everything really hard to see. Didn't help that the movie I was watching was The Batman, which is known for taking place mostly at nighttime, where there are a whole lot of dark colours and tones. I realised that projections in any cinema are rarely going to be near as good at dynamic range as a modern self-illuminating screen like a TV with HDR, but this theatre in particular was especially subpar. Thankfully, I've never had a bad experience like this in any other theatre in the country, so hopefully this was just an outlier. Outside of these anomalies though, I can honestly say that the standard cinema experience really isn't a whole lot different to Australia. I should mention though that unlike Australia and many other countries, there's not really anything in the way of luxury or alternative experiences at the cinema. Things like gold class, boutique, 4D, or even theatres with recliner seats aren't really a thing in Colombia to my knowledge. They do occasionally have 3D for certain movies, and I mentioned earlier about IMAX, of which there are actually a few throughout the country. I suppose they do also have a handful of Onyx sessions as well, which is a newer type of projection technology that displays much better dynamic range. Other than those though, there's not a whole lot of variation beyond the standard theatre offerings. Now regarding ratings, one thing to note is that Colombia obviously has its own classification system. Just to label the different ratings real quick, they have T for todos, which is equivalent to G in the US and Australia, 7 meaning for ages 7 and up, which is like PG in the US and Oz, 12 meaning for 12 and up, more or less the same as a PG-13 in the US or an M in Australia. Then there's 15 for 15 and up, which is like an R in the US or an MA in Australia. And finally 18 for adults, which is like an NC-17 in the US or an R in Australia. Alright, one final thing I wanted to talk about a bit was the different types of session formats. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, the most common format is for the movie to be dubbed in Spanish. However, there are also some sessions that have Spanish subtitles with the film's original language in the audio, which is usually English. Although the Spanish dubbed format is more common, they do generally have sessions with English audio available for just about every US movie as well. Not every multiplex does this, so it's best to check on the cinema's website to see where it's available. Basically, if it says doblado, that means it's dubbed in Spanish, and if it says subtitulado, that means it's in its original language, usually English with Spanish subtitles. As said, there should be subtitle sessions available somewhere for just about every movie, but with certain movies like family films and animation, it's not as widespread, so you may have to search a little harder for it in those cases. A quick tip though, if you happen to be in Bogota, the Cine Colombia multiplex in the Andino shopping mall tends to have subtitled sessions for just about every movie, sometimes even exclusively, so that's generally a safe choice. Anyway, I think I've said everything I can about Colombian cinemas, but if there's anything more you'd like to know about, feel free to leave a comment. Also, if you have a suggestion for a video topic you'd like to see, you can also let me know in the comments and I'll definitely consider it. Until next time though, subscribe, bell, and I'll see you around. Ciao!